Welcome to the Tough Fish Show. I am so excited to bring to you Debbie Weiss. Debbie, thank you so much for being on the show.
Jen, thank you so much for having me.
I am so glad you are here, and I would love for you to start with, how did you get into writing?
I've always enjoyed writing, even through grade school and in high school. I remember we had a writing contest and, two of us got perfect scores and I was so proud of myself. I just enjoyed it. But I put it aside when I got to college and I went to law school. But then I was taking some writing classes, not terribly seriously, but my husband passed in 2013. And when I lost him, I was kind of looking to find a passion again. And I wanted to write about the experience as well. So that really got me into writing pretty seriously.
So first off, I'm sorry to hear about your husband. And then the next thing is, what I hear is someone who has a passion for comfort and nurturing and healing and helping others through something that's difficult. So what was it like working on a piece like that, a memoir, especially one about grieving and death?
Well, it was interesting. After I lost my husband, I wasn't entirely at peak brain power. I call it widow brain. It takes a few years to get it back. And about 14 months after I lost him, I started dating again, which provided endless amounts of material. So I really didn't start with the idea to write a memoir. I started with the idea to write small vignettes. I had a writing class. From there, I'd met some lovely people in the class who became my writing group. So two days a week, I wanted to have something new to talk about, but I didn't have a lot of time. We'd have a half hour to chat about it. So I started to just write smaller pieces. And then from there, I submitted a few things to be published. And, I got some publications, essays. I write essays. And that convinced me, well, okay, I can send this out. I can see it in something besides my own blog. And then from there, I started to write a book. And from there, I had to learn a whole new set of craft, a whole different kind of craft.
I would love for you to go into that further. What exactly do you mean?
Well, an essay, 1,200 words, 1,400 words. I've taught essay writing. It's very compact and it's all in the narrative style. I did this, I felt this was my big revelation. But, a book, I realized, for it to be interesting and to keep the reader going, I wanted it to read more like fiction. So at that point, you have to get into place and dialogue and story arc, for around 300 pages. And that's just a whole bunch of things I didn't know how to do. So, I was writing small pieces. I was reading books about it. Then I started to take some workshops in San Francisco, near where I live. But I had to kind of figure all those pieces out. I think that's really hard for a lot of us because it isn't natural necessarily to just write something that comes across well coherently as an entire book.
I agree that it takes practice. I totally agree that it takes practice. But what I'm hearing is, it wasn't just necessarily a decision of, I'm just going to go do this big step, but it was a series of little steps, a series of smaller things to get comfortable, to see what was possible, and then say, how else can I explore this? And then push that boundary and step more out of the comfort zone and do it again, or do it differently and continue. And realizing that, hey, this book could be something, writing a book could be something I'd really like to do, but there's more I need to be able to do that. So would you talk a little bit more about what you did to hone your skills? I'm
happy to. I read a lot of books. I like a book called Shimmering Images. I think her name is Lisa Dale Norton, because it's very straightforward memoir writing. And when I've taught memoir, I have a little bit, I've used that book because it's vignettes and you put it out. For me, writing kind of paralleled my recovery from losing my husband, my recovery from widowhood in a way. Because, you start slow. For me, I have anxiety, so I do things cautiously. I did not travel across the world. I started with, redecorating my house, joining a few groups. From there, making a few friends, maybe going on a trip by myself, And for the book, it was kind of the same thing, joining a local class, joining a writer's group. putting small pieces together, doing a blog. I was a Huffington Post blogger, submitting to different magazines, and then deciding, well, okay, I'm going to getting a big publication. I got in the New York Times Modern Love column, and that kind of told me, well, you can write at least 1,400 words. You could, that was kind of my encouragement to go forward. I was kind of looking for a sign, and like, okay, well, that's my sign. And from there, I hired a very good editor. I finally broke down and paid the money for a really good editor. And I enrolled in the Masters of Fine Arts program in creative writing at St. Mary's College. So I got an MFA. And that I knew would give me 2 years of intense work. And at the same time, I was teaching writing. So I just had 2 years that were real intense.
Okay, so a few things here I would love to unpack a little bit. So when you're the student, when you are the student turning in the papers, going through the intense training, to your point, that's one experience. When you are teaching the experience, teaching the skill set, the craft, reading the other pieces coming in and offering critique, feedback on them, that's another experience. How did they both help you, and how did you move between them?
Well, the big class that I taught was essay writing, and I knew, and it had a template. It was for something that was very kind of a set thing to do. But it did teach me to have a voice and speak up and feel comfortable talking to a group of, this was through an organization in San Francisco called Writing Pad. And the people who joined were professionals and smart people, and I was pretty intimidated. So it taught me to be a lot less intimidated, and the classes went well. To my surprise, I was very grateful. And then as the student, it's not that hard. I mean, I was a lawyer, but I hadn't done anything like this for a long time. I graduated as an English major, and I graduated from college in 1985. So it was very easy to sit in class, but at the same time, being older and having been through other experiences, I don't really care if I didn't sound that smart, or if maybe what I was saying wasn't perfect. So, I was kind of the person in the back who will go first. Oh, that's me, because once you're in your 50s, it's like, okay, I don't care. I'm just here to learn.
But what I'm hearing is essentially, you found a form of support, the support necessary to build the confidence. So teaching and therefore speaking in front of people was one form of support and one form of training, if you will, as well as your lawyering background would be some of that too. But also the writing that you were doing was another form of speaking up, because it's pen to paper and it's your voice, which is that can still feel intimidating. Sometimes, and depending upon your skill set, maybe that might be more intimidating than speaking in front of others. It could be the reverse. It could be equally, the same. So when you were going through your program, when you were going through the MFA program, and you're working on your craft, working on the skill set, was that when the book started to take some shape and really start to come together? And in the writing, was that a piece you were working on throughout the program, or did that come after the fact?
I'd already been working on the book for quite a while by the time I joined the MFA program in, I believe, 2018.
Okay.
I graduated in 2020. So I'd already been working a lot on the book, but I was working by myself. I mean, it's kind of weird to be your own editor at some point. I was making changes, and they weren't big. They weren't big enough. And that's when the other thing that helped me so tremendously was hiring an editor, a really good editor to go through it. And that also forced me, because she was expensive and I was using her time. So it really made me want to do my best to get the most out of that experience and feel that when I was finished, I had a book that was ready to go. We went through a whole session, and then she was like, well, yeah. And I was like, okay, how much does it cost for another review? It was just a matter of kind of, the goal was to kind of see that it felt finished in some way. So that's intimidating, to try to put your deepest feelings down, and then make them engaging to somebody else.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So to your point about working with the editor, you made a comment there that I really love how you phrased that. And I would love for you to share an example, if possible, where you said that I was working on it and making changes, but they didn't feel big enough. What would be an example of a change that was good and a change that really felt big and big enough?
Well, I can give you a couple things in that. One was just structure. I felt that the book needed a lot of backstory, but backstory can be pretty dreary to read. So I really had to learn how to incorporate it in an interesting way and where to put it, because the backstory and theme had to work with, say, the present time of the book, right? The book is a timeline. So you're here, you're writing about your thing, and then you're going back in time, but they have to mesh in somehow, or else it's very discordant. So that was hard. And then the other thing was just the depth you need. This is a memoir, and that paralleled, in MFA land, the biggest thing we always talked about was go deeper. The book needs more interiority, which means what's the narrator thinking? We're not in their head. We don't get it. And then with the editor, it was the same thing. She's like, well, this is okay, but we're not getting enough of this person. We're not liking the narrator. We don't know what she's thinking. I went through a whole version of the book, and I edited it to how she'd said, with structure and developmental ideas. And when I was finished, she said, well, this is very nice, but you've missed the point. You've idealized your marriage in this book, and that's not the point. We need to see somebody growing out of this marriage, not idealizing it. So, another month of work later.
That is amazing advice to hear and to give, rather. But when you hear that, and then you realize, okay, I understand what you're saying and why. And so on the surface, it seems like I'm going to use the word easy, even though it's not easy, an easy thing to fix, because it's changing the writing and it's changing the focus and making some adjustments. But really what it's requiring is not just going deeper in the writing, but in yourself, and unpacking more and giving yourself space to tend to feelings that might come up that you didn't realize that were going to, until this writing is kind of forcing you to deal with that. So how did you go through that dance of recognizing, okay, if I'm going to do what she's asking and I need to go deeper, I need to make these changes, and stuff's coming up that I didn't anticipate. How did you work through that? And how did you know when to include it and when to say, hey, I needed to work through that, but that is not going in the book?
Well, that's a good point, Jen. That is. Well, I could work. The going deeper was harder. It was interweaving things. By that point, I had kind of a structure. I mean, I feel like when I write, I think for a lot of people, writing is kind of like painting, right? I mean, first you have a sketch, then you fill stuff in, then you look and you go, well, this needs some shadow, this needs some light, this needs more detail, this needs less detail. So it's kind of like adding layers and removing layers sometimes too. So for me, I like to think I got a little bit more of an instinct in terms of saying, this follows, this is a good storyline, this works. And other times saying, this is redundant. We have similar bad dates in this story. This isn't advancing this any further. This is repetitive or redundant. And then at the end saying, I need a hopeful story arc, because I really wanted the story to be hopeful. Especially, for widowed folk and people who've suffered a loss or found themselves alone after long relationships. Even though the book is a little darker in places and it's certainly honest and goes through some bad times, I wanted it ultimately to offer hope. So that helped with creating what I thought was a decent story arc, but also being honest.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I love that you just mentioned that too, that you're the structuring, especially when you're thinking about nonfiction. Your reader is picking up that book because they've identified that this might be part of a solution that they have a problem for. Problem could be a mindset. It could be they need some tangible tips and tricks or guidance. It could be that they just need to know that they're not alone in some ways. So they've started the book in one space, and they need to end that book in a better space, in another space where they have a new appreciation. They've had a mindset shift. even if they come back and reread the book in a year from now, they're in a different space. So that arc is going to still take them to a new level, even though the words didn't change, but the meaning did, because it was a new time to read it. Would you
That
agree
makes
with
sense.
that?
Oh, I agree completely. I agree. Yeah. I mean, it's funny because like when in the MFA land, we talked about any piece of writing, you have the before character and the after character. The before is where you start at the beginning of your piece. The after is where your character is at the end of the piece. But you also want your reader to be going along with that trajectory to feel that before and after. And in the case of a book like mine, you want them to be able to feel a bit of an after. Like, oh, okay, I'm widowed, I'm devastated, but I can see that I can take steps forward. I can see a hope. So I agree. Yeah, you want them at the end to feel something. And I would hope maybe someone who read my book, say, who is a widowed person or dealing with a widowed parent. I've had some younger folks say they're buying it for their parents, kind, to say, oh, I'm in a more hopeful place now. I can see where Debbie was real dark here and I was too, but things are better now. And I can look back on that and feel less lonely or less adrift.
Yeah, what I hear you offering in yours is almost like holding out your hand as a guide and as a friend and saying, "Hi, reader, I understand this is difficult because I've been there too. Take my hand and let me walk with you through a little part of this journey, a few of these steps, and just kind of sit with you, in a space." And that's really what I'm hearing is the willingness to be you're offering compassion, to your point, be vulnerable, honest with what
Yeah.
you did experience, but yet making sure that focus is really about the finishing the arc for the reader to recognize we don't stay here. We're not staying here. And I think that was really powerful for you to do. So when you were working with the editor and on your own through your own edits and such, how did you know when that book was ready? Because you worked through it a few times, and then you're working with this editor, going back, taking the editor's feedback, going again, taking their feedback, incorporating it. But how did you know in your heart that you were ready?
Well, part of it was just that I'd done this a bunch of times. Part of it was the editor said I was ready. She was, it was kind of at the end where she's like, I think you're ready to rock. She didn't have more changes. But what helped me was to read it. And I think this might be where legal training helps, is to feel that it was a progression. When I read things, I felt this followed from here. I don't like the word flashback. This backstory fits here. This explains the character. When I read it, I'm not saying it is seamless, but it started to feel more seamless. And then at the end, the hardest part for me was the last chapter, because in this particular book, I wanted it to be about surviving on your own. So it didn't have a real clear-cut, pretty ending. The heroine at this point doesn't meet her prince. This is a book about kind of finding yourself at middle age. So I had to also ultimately come up with an ending that felt that the character was hopeful and that there was a future, but that it went with a story arc and the theme about finding yourself at middle age, as opposed to being necessarily a rom-com. This is a little more of an anti-rom-com.
Yeah, what I'm hearing really is that happily for now, in the sense too, like I'm happy right where I am. And it's not necessarily about I have to find somebody else to be happy. I've gotten to a space where I can be happy after what I've been through. I can still be happy after what I've been through. And it's not being disingenuous to my spouse in that way. It's saying that you're showing them, you're giving them hope for themselves. And that's really what I'm hearing you say, while, like, to your point, honoring a story arc too, to have it to feel like in a sense, for it to read like fiction, but it's based on you. So yeah, absolutely.
You're right. No, that's exactly it. I mean, one of the things I don't like about some things that are dealing with for widows is some of them, they're real basic, which is fine. And those are very useful books. But some of it doesn't really deal with the darkness and the feelings. It's pretty devastating. I mean, I was with my high school sweetheart. We had 32 years. When he was gone, I was extremely lost. And I made a lot of failures. I had a huge learning curve. And part of what I wanted to show in the book is you can recover and your life can get better, and you will make epic fails. You might make epic fails, but it's okay. You know, you can do this. This isn't eat, pray, love. Not everybody says, fantastic, I'm going to, go to Italy and master pasta. I mean, this is more for, slower steps, how to recreate your psyche and put yourself back together. And I wanted to be super honest about that and how painful that is, but also offer hope that this gets better. Time is a help, but there are steps you can take, but to offer them in a way that's honest and not prescriptive. Because, folks who have had a huge loss, we're not in the best space to be necessarily practicing at that time gratitude or moving forward in a linear fashion. It's all tangled up. And what we do can be all tangled up. But I also wanted to show a hopefulness in that things do get better, and not to give up hope. Because I think a lot of widowed folk were really unhappy in the first few years. But later on, our lives are different, and they are much better. And we have integrated our losses. But it's a long time to go from the beginning to feeling somewhat whole again.
Yeah, and what you hit on something there, where no matter that if there are other books out in a similar genre, or even in a similar, or even very much the same genre, same topics, even, there's still different readers for different books, even within the same genre. So don't hold yourself back. If you want to write a story, if you want to share your story, and if you're worried, hey, there's all these other books out here about grief, about loss, and it's memoir, how is mine going to stand out? Yours is different because it's yours, and your readers are going to resonate with that just as other readers might resonate with another story. And they overlap, and yet some are different. But the fact that you've written your story, you're going to connect with the right readers. And the more you talk about it, the more you help your readers to find you. But at least those right readers are going to find you, just like you were saying, where this is for someone who might need to go at a slower pace. That's okay. That might be that's a way to describe that reader even.
I think so. I agree. Because I know when I was widowed, I was looking for different widow books. I had a friend who was surprisingly widowed after a long marriage, and she is a big deal lawyer, extremely successful. And she was looking for books that would be helpful to her. I was kind of trying to explain some of it you can't get from a book, but she didn't like a ton of them. She came over to my house with two smallest shopping bags full of books. She said, I tried all these. This is your competition. I don't like any of them. Write something. Get it out there. And it was like, well, okay, here's a very well-read, very well-educated widowed person, and none of this is resonating for her. So she wants something else, and maybe my book wasn't it. But I did worry about that because, I was a suburban person. I didn't have a tremendously exciting past. And yet people did connect with it. In the MFA classes, I was happy when I call them kids, people in their 30s liked it, and people related to it. So, and sometimes, they thought it was, again, helpful for parents or even younger widowed folk, or just people who are trying to find themselves, because it's a big thing about, finding yourself when you've been maybe submerged with other things or family or relationships. So I do think that there's space for this kind of thing, even if there are other books on that topic. You have your own turn of phrase, you have your own trajectory, you have your own way of explaining things, and that might be just what it takes for someone to feel less alone, or for someone who's very sad to get off the couch and say, okay, she did it and she hated it, but I can put on not soft pants and go to one event.
I love how you put that. And what you've brought to my mind at this moment is thinking about, let's fast forward a bit. The book is published, the book is out, and now we're talking about getting it into the hands of readers. So what kind of things have you done to help promote the book and to get the book into the hands of your readers?
I can't say I've been horrifically successful with this, but I have tried. I am doing a lot of podcasts. Thank you very much. For me, I love doing it. I love talking to people. It's really fun. So I do a lot of podcasts. I've even joined a couple podcast sites, but I just reach out and I'll, podcasts about grief. Okay. Podcasts about midlife. Okay. I do a lot of that. I've done a few things with local bookstores. I live in a small town and our local magazine and our local newspaper have featured me. So it's all been at a local level. I've reached out to a few organizations like National Memoir Writers Association, who are such lovely people, just run by this wonderful person, who have been more than kind. So I've reached out to and some smaller things that make sense. I post on my social media. I joined TikTok. I have a very silly video called Dating After 50. I'm going to that. I post, videos of me reading. I'm pretty shameless. I did an Instagram book tour, which was a lot of fun. I think that was useful. Giveaways. I have not had much luck trying to get into a big scale. I've submitted stuff to Oprah that didn't happen. I have gotten stuff in a wonderful publication, Next Avenue. It's a PBS publication for mature folk. Having something coming up in Huffington Post Personals. I've sent some stuff out again, but it varies. It's very frustrating to do this on your own because people don't get back to you. And I would say I tried a traditional publicist, and that was not a success for me. I don't know how well that works for folks who don't already have a big following or are famous. That might work for other people. I have to say in good conscience to your listeners, if you're a new author and you're looking at this, be careful where you put a lot of money. It might not come back to you. It's important, I think, to be realistic and to be very financially prudent. Lawyer speak.
Well, no, I agree with you. I agree with you. And sometimes spending that money on something might be a calculated risk, that it's the right thing to do. And in other cases, it might not be. And you're right. It's one of those things where, does this really serve? How does this serve? What can you anticipate coming back? But to your point, I think the thing is what I really hear you talking about with what you've done thus far to get your book out and sharing it is you are continually showing up. You're continually trying something. So a form of experimenting with it and saying, does this work? Does this not? What have I enjoyed? What do I keep wanting to do? And the fact that you mentioned, for instance, not just the podcasting space, but in particular, where could your book fit, looking at not just it being memoir, but the different themes, and do those themes show up in podcasts like you said, midlife or in grief? How could you make a connection between what you've written and that show so that it makes sense for those listeners, but then it puts you in front of new people who would connect with you and your book? So I love that you said that.
Thank you. And you're right. I did. I've looked at that, and I also I don't have a regular job. I retired many years ago from practicing law, but I am a researcher. So I will look, if I see an author that has a similar kind of book, I'll say, okay, well, where did they show up? What podcasts were they on? Where did they, connect with people? And I pulled some themes out, not just widowhood, which I started with, but then grief and also midlife, because there's a huge industry for women at midlife. There is a huge one. And I was actually lucky to be contracted by a woman who did a series, January Talk series, Cherie Clark. And it was like 3 days of midlife women experts. And I'm so grateful she reached out to me. But it's a thing. I mean, you can get, people are interested. And I think a lot of my fellow authors, even if they're not writing about widowhood or dating at midlife like I am, could look at the idea of vibrancy and women recreating themselves at midlife, because they are recreating themselves as authors. And there's this whole industry that I think would welcome them. And then secondly, be interested in their stories, because they're good stories. I'm reading them,
I love how you have put that, because I mean, really that logic applies to any book that you've written. If you look at your book and you think about the themes, you think about the elements, how can you bring those elements, use them, tease them out, but it comes back to the same hub, your book. So I really love how you have just showed how that is possible. Debbie, where can people connect with you and where can they get your book? And what's the
Well,
name of the book too? Make sure you mention that.
oh, that's a good point. I was having too much fun talking. Oh, I do actually have it here. It is called Available as Is, A Midlife Widow's Search for Love, but Available as Is. People can connect with me on my website, Debbie Weiss Author. I have an author page on Facebook, Debbie Weiss Author. I'm on Instagram, Debbie Weiss Author. I'm even on TikTok as, I think, DK Weiss Writer. I'm not there a lot. You can most obviously find my book on Amazon, where it has a decent number of very positive reviews. And even better, you can order it through your local bookstore, which might not have it on the shelves. But the two local bookstores where I grew up in Danville and where I live in Benicia have been so generous to me stocking the book and having an interest in it that, you know, I just think it's wonderful to be in an independent bookstore.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Debbie, this has been awesome. Thank you so much for being on the show.
Thank you, Jen. This was a real treat. I love this.